So, if you're a real estate agent, you're negotiating a sales contract. This is something that we see very commonly on inspections. A lot of the time, a real estate agent will negotiate a seller credit for any deficiencies that they might find on a home inspection during the inspection period, right? So maybe the water heater needs to be replaced. A lot of the times, the real estate agent will negotiate a seller credit. Let's just say $2,500 is the cost to replace a water heater, so they will ask for a $2,500 credit um, on the sales contract. Something that some agents don't know that I've run across with in the past is seller concessions or seller credits on a financed real estate deal are capped by the lender, right? So depending on the situation, depending on what kind of property it is, depending on what kind of loan the buyer is getting, depending on how much they are putting down, there might be a limit to what the seller concessions are. That could be 2%, it could be 3%, it could be 6%. It depends on the program. Um, the other limitation is that seller credits cannot be utilized towards your down payment. The only thing that they can be utilized towards is closing costs and prepaids. So, for example, if you're buying a house for $500,000, you negotiate a $25,000 seller concession because the roof needs to be replaced or the deck needs to be replaced or there's some sort of work that needs to be done that the seller doesn't want to do before closing, right? So you negotiate a $25,000 seller credit. That's 5%. So that may or may not be allowable just based on a percentage of the loan amount, right? Or of the sales price. That $25,000 may be too much already without even taking into consideration what the closing costs are. But let's just say, for example, that you are um, getting an FHA loan, which allows for 6% seller contribution. So you're fine there. However, your loan has very low closing costs because you negotiated lender credits with your mortgage company, right? So your closing costs are only $10,000. In this example, that difference, that delta between what your credit is and what the closing costs are, would get left on the table, which nobody wants. So in this situation, you've got $25,000 in seller credits, seller contributions, and only $10,000 in closing costs that they can be applied towards. That $15,000 would just go back to the seller, which you as a buyer certainly don't want. So the way around this, what you do as a real estate agent, if you are negotiating seller concessions, especially big seller concessions like this, it is super, super important that you talk to your loan originator, that you talk to your loan officer that you're working with before you put anything into the contract. Because what we don't want to have happen, and what I've seen have to happen before, is at the 11th hour, you have to go and start reducing. You realize there's only $10,000 in closing costs. The other 15,000 are going to get left on the table. So you have to start reducing the sales price or putting that money into a repair escrow to pay contractors directly. All of this stuff, if you need to make some adjustments like that and adjust it off of the sale price, you want to do that sooner rather than later because nobody likes um, doing that like at the closing table. And I actually had a situation not too long ago where this occurred. The seller credits exceeded the closing cost by a pretty considerable amount. It was by 15 or $20,000. And at the 11th hour, the seller basically said, "Nope, too bad, so sad, we're not giving it to you." And they had to sue. The buyers had to sue, and ultimately they got the money in the form of a repair escrow, which was used to directly pay contractors to actually do the work that was going to be done with that money. But it turned into a big issue, delayed closing by several weeks. The buyers had to pay rate lock extension costs, and they had to pay for an attorney to sue the sellers to get them to honor that agreement that they had made. So, it's very, very, very important that if you're a real estate agent, you're negotiating this type of stuff, that you have clear and open communication with your loan officer. If that's with me, I always, like to discuss that, and we'll come up with a strategy on how we can avoid leaving any of that closing costs on the table, any of that seller credit. Because at the end of the day, we as mortgage or real estate professionals, what we want to do is we want to get the best deal and do right by our clients. So it's just very important that we are aware, because as a real estate agent, we do not expect that you are going to be acutely familiar with interested party contribution limits on different loan types and like this, it's not your job to know this stuff. However, it is my job to know this stuff. So, we always like to make sure that we're a resource for our real estate agent partners while they're doing a deal, because the last thing you want to do is have, you know, a pointing match about, well, you should have done this, or you should have done that, and the buyer is mad because they're losing out on 15,000. You know what I mean? They're losing out on money that could be used towards their closing costs or towards fixing their new house. So it's just a little thing, a little detail. By being extra careful about this stuff, it's one of those situations that, like, once you see this mistake made, once, like, I've seen it a few times over my career, and I guarantee you that the agents um, that have made this mistake and had it come back and bite them, where they had to scramble at the last minute, I guarantee you they're never going to do it again. So it's just one of those situations. Once you see it, you have a hard lesson sometimes, and you'll learn once, and that's how we get better.